until one broken cowboy walked into hell. No man dared step into the blizzard to save them. Snow had begun falling in mid-November, soft at first, then heavier, piling up over the roads and rooftops until it felt like the town itself was buried under a white blanket. By December, the blizzard had become relentless, a swirling, angry force that made even stepping outside dangerous. The wind howled like a living thing, whipping through the streets and rattling windows, and the snow piled so high it seemed to block out the sun. Every corner of the town, from the saloon to the church, bore the marks of winter's wrath. Icicles hung like jagged swords from the eaves of every building, and the few hardy animals that remained struggled to survive beneath the snow's cold weight. Inside the general store, the townspeople huddled together, their breath forming clouds in the cold, airless room. Conversations were low and tense, filled with worry over the families trapped beyond the town, miners stranded in the mountains, and travelers who had vanished days ago in the blinding storm. The store's shelves were half empty. Flour, sugar, and firewood were in short supply. Every person knew that if the blizzard lasted much longer, hunger and cold could take as many lives as the storm itself. Sheriff Harris paced back and forth behind the counter, his boots crunching against the thin layer of snow that had blown in through the door. He ran his hand over his face, stubble scraping his palm, and sighed. "We can't just sit here," he said. "People are trapped. They need help, and we're the only ones who can try." A man named Thomas, a farmer with frost-bitten fingers and a face worn by years of work, shook his head. "Sheriff, I've lost 2 neighbors already. You think I want to go out into that? There's no one who makes it through that storm." "But we can't just wait for them to die," another voice said, rising in panic. It was Mary, the schoolteacher, her eyes wide with fear. "They're our people. They need us." The room fell silent for a moment. Outside, the wind screamed over the rooftops, and a snowdrift slammed against the door. It was as if the storm itself was daring anyone to step outside, daring them to challenge the danger that had claimed so many. In the corner of the store, an old miner shook his head slowly. "We tried," he muttered. "A few of us went after them last week. Never came back, don't even know where they are now." His voice trembled, not from fear, but from the bitter cold seeping into his bones. The sheriff rubbed his forehead, frustration mixing with despair. "We can't just give up on them," he said finally, more to himself than to the others. "But no man who goes out there is likely to return. The storm, it's like hell itself." For hours, the townspeople debated, their voices growing louder and more desperate. Some suggested sending a small party, a handful of men who knew the mountains. Others said it was too dangerous, that even the best trackers and strongest riders wouldn't make it through the whiteout conditions. As the night drew closer, fear had a tight grip on everyone. The warmth of their small homes and the fire in their hearths were all they had to cling to, but even that felt fragile under the endless assault of snow and wind. Then, just as hope seemed nearly gone, a figure appeared at the edge of the town, moving carefully through the thickening snow. He was a man dressed in worn leather, a wide-brimmed hat pulled low over his face, and a long coat dusted with frost. His boots sank deep into the snow with every step, and his movements were deliberate, almost silent. The townspeople stopped what they were doing and watched him from the windows. No one recognized him immediately. There were whispers. Who was this stranger, wandering into Frost Creek at a time like this? The storm seemed to fight him at every step, but still he came forward, shoulders squared against the wind. Some children peeked through cracks in the shutters, imagining him as a hero from the stories their fathers told, the ones who could survive anything. Adults, however, were cautious, unsure whether he was friend or foe. Finally, he reached the general store. The door creaked as he pushed it open, letting a gust of snow spill inside. He shook the white powder from his coat and removed his hat. His face was lined and rough, the kind of face that spoke of hard years and harder choices. His eyes, though tired, burned with a quiet determination. "Evening," he said, voice low but steady, carrying over the murmurs of the worried townspeople. "Name S. Jake. I hear some folks are in trouble out there." Silence followed. People stared, uncertain what to make of him. He was a stranger, yes, but there was something about him that felt different. He didn't look for comfort or sympathy. He didn't hesitate. He simply stood there, waiting, steady as the snow swirled around him. Sheriff Harris cleared his throat. You know the storm?" he asked cautiously. "You know what's out there?" Jake nodded. "I know enough," he said. "It's bad, worse than most will admit, but it's not impossible. People are still alive, and if someone doesn't go, they won't make it." The word struck the townspeople like a cold wind. Someone had to go. Someone had to risk the storm. But who? None of them had the courage, or perhaps the recklessness, to face what lay beyond the valley. Thomas, the farmer, finally spoke. "You think you can make it?" His voice was skeptical, almost bitter. "No one else has." Jake looked at him steadily. "I don't know if I can make it," he admitted. "But I know I have to try. Someone has to." The sheriff exchanged a glance with Mary, who nodded slowly. The town had been frozen in fear for too long. Seeing this man, this stranger, this cowboy with something broken in his eyes, step forward with purpose stirred something in their hearts. It was the first sign of hope they had felt in days. After a long pause, the sheriff said, "All right, if you're serious, you're going to need help. You'll need supplies, food, maybe a sled. You can't do this alone." Jake shook his head. "I can do it alone. I've done worse before." His voice held a quiet authority that silenced further objections. The townspeople watched him prepare. He gathered rope, warm blankets, dried meat, and a few lanterns. He examined his horse, a sturdy black stallion, brushing the snow from its coat and checking its hooves. Every movement he made was careful and deliberate. The storm raged outside, but inside the general store, a strange calm settled. Children pressed their faces to the windows, marveling at the figure who dared to defy the blizzard. Women whispered prayers under their breath, and the men looked on, some with envy, some with fear, but all with a growing sense of awe. Finally, Jake swung his leg over the horse and gave a nod to the sheriff. "I'll be back," he said simply. And with that he rode into the blizzard. The wind howled around him, the snow thickened, and the mountains loomed ahead, white and unforgiving. Every step into the storm was a battle, every gust of wind a challenge. But the townspeople watched, hearts pounding, as he disappeared into the white. Inside the store, the silence after his departure was profound. The fire crackled in the stove, and snow continued to fall outside, but a strange hope lingered. Maybe, just maybe, someone could face hell itself and bring the lost back. Maybe courage could still exist, even in the coldest, darkest places. No one knew what awaited Jake out there, nor if he would return. But for the first time in many days, Frost Creek dared to hope. And as the night grew darker and the storm more furious, one broken cowboy rode alone into hell, determined to defy the blizzard, save the trapped, and prove that even in the harshest winters, bravery could still shine. The snow whipped across the mountains like a living wall, thick and unrelenting, blinding anyone who dared to step into it. Jake leaned into the wind, his coat flapping around him, and urged his horse forward. Every step was a struggle. Snowdrifts towered like frozen waves, hiding rocks, crevices, and sudden drops. Even the strongest horse shivered beneath him, its breath steaming in the icy air. But Jake pressed on, steady and determined. He had faced storms before, storms that cut through the skin and chilled the bones. But this one was different. The wind was vicious, unpredictable, and it carried a strange, eerie silence beneath its roar. Every so often, he thought he heard voices or cries lost in the snow. But when he paused, all that remained was the sound of the wind and the distant groan of frozen branches. As he rode deeper into the mountains, memories of his past flashed through his mind. Jake had not always been a lonely figure wandering the frontier. There had been a family once, a wife with a soft smile and a little boy who loved horses as much as he did. But fire had taken them in a single night, leaving him with nothing but guilt and the cold weight of loss. Since that day he had roamed from town to town, a broken man carrying pain that never healed. Yet somehow that pain gave him strength now. It had taught him endurance, taught him how to survive when everything else seemed lost. And as he pushed his horse through the snow, he clung to the idea that he could make a difference, that he could save those trapped in the mountains. He had nothing to lose and everything to prove, to himself and to the people who had no hope left. Hours passed, or maybe minutes. Time was hard to measure in a storm that never seemed to end. The cold seeped through his gloves and coat, biting at his fingers and ears. His face was raw and numb, but he ignored the pain. He had a purpose. He had a mission. And nothing, not even the storm, could stop him. As he rode, Jake began to notice signs of struggle left by others who had tried and failed. A sled half buried in snow, a broken lantern, tracks that ended abruptly, all markers of people who had not survived the journey. Each one of these remnants made his chest tighten, but it also steeled his resolve. He could not let fear control him. He could not fail. Around midday, the storm reached its peak. Visibility was almost zero. The mountains, usually grand and imposing, now looked like ghostly shapes emerging from the snow. Jake knew he was entering the most dangerous part of the pass, where avalanches were common and cliffs could appear without warning. He slowed the horse, feeling for solid ground beneath the snow, relying on instincts honed by years of hardship. Suddenly, a sound made him stop. It was faint, a cry muffled by the wind. He strained his ears and listened. There it was again, closer this time. He dismounted and led his horse carefully through a narrow trail, each step uncertain. The snow had hidden a small ravine, and down below he could see movement. It was a group of miners, huddled together for warmth, their faces pale and lips blue. They were trapped in a small dip, unable to climb back up the slope because the snow had blocked the path. Fear and exhaustion were written on every face. They looked up at Jake, unsure whether to hope or despair. "I'm here to get you out," Jake called, his voice cutting through the wind. "Stay calm, follow me, and don't panic." The miners hesitated. One of them, a tall man with a frostbitten nose, asked, Who are you?" Jake didn't answer with his past or his losses. "Call me someone who knows the mountains. We don't have time for introductions." "Can you move?" Slowly, with Jake's guidance, they began to climb. He helped the weakest first, wrapping blankets around them and offering encouragement. Every step was grueling. The snow threatened to swallow them, and the wind pushed against their progress. At one point, an icy gust nearly threw one of the men off balance, but Jake grabbed him just in time. Through the climb, the story of the miners emerged. They had been working in a remote mine when the storm hit, and their path back to town had been blocked by falling snow. They had tried to signal for help, but the blizzard swallowed every attempt. Days had passed, and they had begun to lose hope. Some had even whispered to each other that no one would come, but Jake's presence changed everything. His calm determination was contagious. Even those who were weak and afraid found strength in his actions. They followed him blindly, trusting the stranger who had stepped into the storm when no one else would. By evening, they reached a small outcropping where the snow had piled less deeply. Jake paused, letting the miners rest and eat a few pieces of dried meat. He checked their injuries, tended to frostbitten fingers, and offered warm water that he had carried in a small flask. The men were grateful but silent, too exhausted to speak much. As night fell, the storm showed no sign of letting up. Snow fell thicker than ever, and the wind carried a howl that made the mountains seem alive. Jake knew that the hardest part was still ahead, the return journey down to town. Avalanches were common in this pass, and the snow had grown unstable. One wrong step could send them tumbling into the icy abyss below. He looked at the miners, their faces pale in the dim light of the lanterns. He could see fear but also trust. They had put their lives in his hands. He could not fail them, not now. The journey back was even more treacherous. Every step required care. Jake scouted the path ahead, breaking trail through the deep snow for the men to follow. He kept their pace slow but steady, making sure no one slipped or wandered into danger. At one point, a section of snow cracked with a loud roar. Jake shouted a warning just in time, and the miners jumped back as the snow settled again. His heart pounded, but he did not show it. Panic would have been worse than the storm. Through it all, Jake's mind kept returning to his past. The family he had lost, the friends who had betrayed him, the nights spent alone by cold fires, all of it had led him here. And yet, in this moment, he felt a clarity he had not known in years. He had a purpose. He was not just surviving anymore. He was saving lives. The pain that had once broken him was now driving him forward. Hours passed, and the storm began to ease slightly as they descended the mountains. The wind was still fierce, but the snow had lightened, and the outlines of Frost Creek appeared faintly in the distance. The miners began to regain some of their strength, encouraged by the sight of the town that meant warmth, shelter, and safety. Finally, as the first lights of the town glimmered through the snow, the group approached the outskirts. Children pressed their faces against windows, staring at the miraculous sight of survivors returning. Townspeople rushed out with blankets and warm drinks, helping the exhausted miners to safety. Shouts of relief and gratitude echoed in the streets, carried through the cold night air. Jake rode in last, his horse tired but steady. He had accomplished what no one else had dared to attempt. He had braved the storm, faced the dangers of the mountains, and returned with those who had been trapped. But he did not linger. There was no celebration for him, no praise he sought. He simply dismounted, checked on the miners, and ensured they were safe before slipping quietly to the edge of town. People stared at him with awe. They had seen the impossible happen. A man, broken by life and haunted by the past, had walked into hell itself and come back with survivors. Stories would be told for generations about this night, about the courage of the cowboy who refused to let fear control him, who faced the blizzard when no one else could. But Jake did not dwell on the glory. He knew the storm could return at any time. He knew that others were still out there, waiting for help. And deep down, he understood that this was only the beginning. The mountains were harsh, the winter unyielding, and the blizzard was only one part of the challenge. He mounted his horse again, ready to face whatever came next. For Jake, there was no turning back. The broken cowboy had found purpose, and that purpose would carry him through whatever trials awaited in the frozen wilderness. And as he rode into the night, past the grateful town and toward the shadows of the mountains, one thing was certain. Courage, even in a broken man, could shine brighter than the fiercest storm. The mountains rose before Jake like frozen giants, their peaks hidden behind a veil of snow and mist. He could feel the storm intensifying as he climbed higher, the wind slicing through his coat, freezing his face and stealing the warmth from his bones. Every step forward was a battle, not only against the snow but against exhaustion and fear. Yet he did not stop. He could not. The thought of those still trapped in the mountain passes drove him onward, a relentless force stronger than any wind or ice. The path ahead was treacherous. Snow had covered familiar landmarks, and the mountains seemed to shift beneath him as the storm raged. Rocks jutted out from the ice like jagged teeth, and crevices yawned like open mouths, threatening to swallow the unwary. One wrong step could mean death. He tightened his grip on the reins, urging his horse slowly but steadily forward. The animal shivered under the cold, its breath steaming in the air, yet it obeyed every command, sensing the determination of its rider. Jake's mind wandered briefly to the stories of past rescues, men who had ventured into similar storms and never returned. He knew the risks, and he accepted them. In his heart, he carried a sense of purpose that had been absent for years. The fire that had once been extinguished by tragedy now glowed faintly but steadily, warming him from the inside out. He was not just surviving anymore. He was fighting for others, for lives that depended on his courage. As he climbed higher, he began to notice signs of the storm's fury. Trees bent under the weight of ice and snow, their branches snapping like brittle bones. Rocks and snow had tumbled from the cliffs, creating new obstacles in the path. The ground beneath him groaned, a warning that the mountain itself was alive and dangerous. He paused for a moment to catch his breath, scanning the horizon. The visibility was nearly zero. The snow swirled around him in a white frenzy, erasing all sense of direction. He adjusted his hat and coat, securing the ropes and supplies he carried. Food and blankets were tucked into his pack, along with lanterns and tools he might need for emergencies. Every item had a purpose, and he could not afford to forget anything. The storm would not forgive mistakes. Hours passed, or maybe it was a single endless hour. Time had no meaning in the blinding snow. Jake's muscles ached, his fingers were numb despite gloves, and his face felt raw from the wind. Still, he pressed on. The thought of those trapped miners, the travelers stranded along the pass, and the families waiting in the town below kept him moving. He knew he was their only hope, and that responsibility was a weight he could not drop. Then, ahead, he saw movement. At first, it was a faint shadow, barely distinguishable in the white chaos. But as he drew closer, he realized it was another traveler, or perhaps a group struggling through the snow. They were frozen and exhausted, their clothing torn and their steps faltering. Fear and desperation radiated from them like heat from a fire. Jake's heart tightened. He had to reach them before the storm claimed them. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice cutting through the roar of the wind. The travelers looked up, their eyes wide with disbelief and relief. "I'm here to help. Follow me. Keep moving and stay close." They hesitated for a moment, but then, seeing the determination in his eyes and the confidence in his actions, they obeyed. Jake led them carefully through the treacherous terrain, stepping over rocks, around frozen streams, and along narrow ledges. Each step required focus and balance, as the snow threatened to collapse under their weight. As they climbed, he learned their story. They had been a small group of traders caught in the storm, trying to reach Frost Creek before the blizzard hit. Their horses had given out, leaving them stranded, and they had been surviving on what little supplies they had. Hunger and frostbite were beginning to take their toll. One young man had already collapsed, unable to continue. Jake acted quickly, lifting him onto his back and encouraging him to hold on. The mountain seemed determined to stop them at every turn. Snow drifts blocked paths, ice-covered rocks made footing impossible, and sudden gusts threatened to push them off the trail. At one point, a small avalanche roared down a nearby slope, burying a section of the path in seconds. Jake shielded the group behind a rock outcropping, counting each heartbeat as the snow thundered past. When the roar faded, he checked the travelers. They were shaken, but alive. Relief washed over them, and they whispered prayers of thanks. Despite the danger, Jake pressed on. The storm was relentless, but he refused to give in to fear. He reminded himself that stopping now would mean death for those depending on him. Step by step, he led the travelers higher into the mountains, through narrow passes where the wind cut like knives and snowdrifts threatened to engulf them entirely. As night fell, the blizzard showed no sign of weakening. Visibility dropped even further, and the temperature plummeted. Jake knew they needed shelter. He searched the area and found a small overhang in the rocks, a natural shelter that would at least protect them from the worst of the wind. They huddled together, sharing blankets and trying to conserve warmth. Jake distributed food and water, keeping spirits high despite exhaustion and fear. Around the small fire he managed to light, he spoke quietly to the group. "We're going to make it. The storm is strong, but we're stronger. Stay close, keep moving, and don't give up. His words were simple, but they carried authority and hope. The travelers clung to his guidance, finding strength in the calm determination of the broken cowboy who had walked into hell itself. Sleep came in short bursts, shallow and uneasy, as the wind howled and snow shifted above them. Jake stayed awake for most of the night, listening to the storm, checking the path ahead and making plans for the next stage of the journey. He knew the worst was yet to come, the final stretch of the pass where cliffs dropped away and avalanches were most frequent. Every decision would matter. One mistake and everyone could be lost. By morning, the storm had eased slightly, though it remained fierce. Jake helped the travelers to their feet and they continued the climb. Each step was slower than the last, but progress was being made. He encouraged the weakest, adjusted the path for safety, and constantly scanned the terrain for danger. The mountains were beautiful in their frozen silence, but deadly. Every step reminded him that nature could be both breathtaking and merciless. Along the way, he reflected on his life and why he had chosen to take this path. Years of loss had left him with little to hold on to, yet in this moment he found purpose. Saving lives, facing the storm, and protecting those who could not protect themselves gave him a reason to keep moving forward. The pain of the past was still there, but it no longer controlled him. It had become fuel, driving him onward through the frozen hell. Finally, they reached the point where the cliffs began to rise sharply. The path was narrow, and the snow beneath their feet threatened to give way. Jake led the travelers single file, carefully testing each step. He held out his hands to help them across gaps, pulling them from the edge when the snow shifted unexpectedly. Fear was etched on every face, but they trusted him completely. The climb was exhausting, but step by step, they reached a plateau where the snow had settled. Here, they could rest briefly, catch their breath, and prepare for the final stretch. Jake checked their condition. Frostbite was beginning to appear, hands and faces red and numb, but no one was seriously injured. They had survived the worst of the climb so far, thanks to his guidance and courage. Looking at the group, Jake felt a sense of quiet pride. They were alive against all odds. The storm was fierce, but determination, careful planning, and courage had carried them this far. He knew the journey was not over, but for the first time he allowed himself a moment to feel hope. And as they pressed onward, deeper into the heart of the blizzard, one thing was certain. The broken cowboy would not stop until everyone was safe. The mountains, the storm, and the dangers of the pass were formidable, but Jake's resolve was stronger. He would face whatever came next, because courage, even in the darkest moments, could shine brighter than any storm. The wind howled like a wild animal, rattling the rocks and driving snow into every crevice. Jake pushed forward, his horse plodding through the deep drifts, muscles straining against the icy terrain. The storm had not relented. If anything, it had grown more violent as he neared the heart of the mountain pass. Visibility was nearly zero, and the snow seemed to swallow all sound except the howling wind. Every step required caution, every movement demanded focus. One wrong move and the cliffs below could claim him, and the lives he had come to save. Hours passed, the journey slow and grueling. Jake's body ached, his fingers numb despite heavy gloves, and his face was raw from the wind. Yet he pressed on, driven by a determination that had been forged in loss and hardened by years of hardship. The mountain was merciless, but so was life, and he had learned that sometimes courage was the only choice when faced with impossible odds. Finally, through the swirling white, he spotted signs of human life. A faint smoke plume rose from the snow-covered rocks, barely visible against the storm's fury. He knew immediately. Miners, trapped in a makeshift shelter, struggling to survive. Relief and urgency surged through him. He could see them, but they were weak, frightened, and close to despair. The snow had cut them off from the world for days, their supplies exhausted, their spirits near breaking. "Hold on, I'm coming." Jake shouted over the roar of the blizzard. His voice was strong, steady, carrying the promise of help through the storm. The miners looked up, disbelief and hope mingling in their eyes. For days, they had thought no one would come. And now, against all odds, here was a man walking through the storm, alone, determined to save them. He rode closer, using his horse to clear the path of the deepest drifts. The snow was treacherous, concealing cracks and loose rocks, but Jake's experience and instinct guided them safely. Each step forward required concentration and skill. When the horse stumbled slightly, he steadied it, glancing at the miners huddled in their shelter. They were exhausted, trembling, and in desperate need of help. Jake dismounted and approached them on foot. He assessed their condition quickly. Several were frostbitten, their hands and faces red and swollen. One man's leg was twisted from slipping on ice and he could barely stand. Jake acted fast, offering warmth and encouragement. "We're going to get out of here," he said firmly. "Follow my lead, step by step, and no one gets left behind." The miners nodded, too weak to speak much but clinging to his words like lifelines. Jake gathered what supplies he had, distributing blankets, small amounts of food, and water. "We'll take it slow," he said. "The mountain will try to stop us, but we're stronger." The journey back down the slope was even more dangerous than he had anticipated. Snow and ice had shifted during the night, blocking familiar paths and creating new hazards. Every step required careful consideration. Avalanches were a constant threat, and the cliffs below were hidden beneath drifts of snow. Jake scouted ahead, finding the safest route, sometimes crawling on his hands and knees to test the stability of the ground. At one point, a sudden rumble froze him in place. A section of the mountain had begun to shift, a small avalanche forming above them. Without hesitation, he yelled, "Move back," and guided the miners to a safer position behind a rocky outcrop. The snow thundered past, brushing over them, but they were unharmed. For a brief moment, relief washed over them, followed by renewed fear. The storm was relentless and the mountain was alive with danger. Despite the exhaustion and fear, Jake remained calm. He offered encouragement, steady hands, and quiet reassurance. "We've made it this far," he said. "Keep moving, don't stop now." Each miner leaned on him, some physically, others emotionally. His presence gave them strength. Where fear had taken root, courage began to grow, nurtured by his determination and experience. Hours dragged on, the journey painstaking and slow. The miners faltered at times, slipping in the snow, trembling from cold and exhaustion. Jake helped each one, offering support and guidance. When one man's foot became numb and painful, he fashioned a makeshift boot from a blanket to protect it. When another began to panic at the edge of a steep drop, he held him steady, speaking calmly until the fear subsided. At one point, the storm seemed to take a personal interest in their survival. A gust of wind nearly threw one miner over the edge of the path, and a loose rock slid dangerously close. Jake's instincts were sharp. He lunged forward, grabbing the man just in time and pulling him to safety. The miner gasped, overwhelmed by the experience, and whispered thanks between shivers. Jake nodded, his focus already on the next obstacle. The journey continued, each step a test of endurance and courage. The miners relied on Jake, and he relied on himself, his years of experience guiding him through terrain that could easily have claimed their lives. He remembered the townspeople who waited below, imagining their worry and prayers. That thought gave him added strength. He could not fail. Not now, not after coming this far. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the edge of the blizzard's worst fury began to ease. The snow was still thick, the wind sharp, but the path ahead was clearer. The miners began to regain strength, their hope renewed by the sight of progress. They huddled close to Jake, following every step, trusting him completely. As they approached a narrow ridge, the most dangerous section of the mountain, Jake paused. The path was sheer, with cliffs on either side and unstable snow beneath. One false step could send them tumbling into the abyss below. He examined the ridge carefully, testing each footfall, and created a safe passage for the group. Step by step, they crossed, tense and silent, hearts pounding with the fear of the drop and the excitement of survival. When they finally reached a wider plateau, Jake allowed himself a brief moment to breathe. The miners were exhausted but alive. He gave them water, checked their injuries, and offered words of encouragement. "We're not out of the storm yet," he said. "But we've made it through the worst. Keep moving. Town is close." The descent continued slowly, each step measured, as the storm gradually relented. The miners drew strength from Jake's determination. He had become more than a guide. He had become a symbol of hope, proof that courage could overcome even the most merciless conditions. His past, his losses, and his solitude seemed to give him an inner strength that others could not match. Finally, after hours of grueling travel, the lights of Frost Creek appeared faintly in the distance. The miners gasped and pointed, their tired faces breaking into smiles. Relief washed over them, a wave of emotion so strong it made them tremble. They had survived the impossible, guided by a man who had walked into hell itself and refused to turn back. Jake led them into the outskirts of town. People had gathered, watching and waiting, and the sight of the survivors returning sparked cheers and shouts of joy. Children ran to the streets, waving and laughing despite the cold. Townspeople rushed out with blankets, food, and warm drinks, helping the miners to safety. Gratitude and amazement filled the air. The miners could hardly speak, overwhelmed by the experience and by Jake's courage. One of them, a man with frostbitten fingers and a sunken face, said simply, We thought no one would come. We thought we were done." Jake nodded quietly, without pride or boast. "I promised we'd make it," he said. "And we did. Stick together, keep warm, you're safe now." Though the town celebrated and offered thanks, Jake did not linger. He checked on each miner, ensuring they were warm and fed, then quietly prepared to leave. The storm could return at any moment, and there were others still out in the mountains who needed help. His work was far from over. As he mounted his horse and rode toward the edge of the town, people watched in awe. He was the broken cowboy, a man haunted by loss, yet capable of incredible bravery. He had faced the storm, saved lives, and returned unscathed, but without seeking glory. His actions spoke louder than words, a testament to the power of courage, resilience, and selflessness. And as the town celebrated the miraculous return of the miners, Jake rode into the distance, ready to face whatever challenges remained in the frozen wilderness. The blizzard had tested him, pushed him to the edge, and forced him to confront both nature and himself. Yet he had emerged stronger, more determined, and ready to continue his mission. For Jake, there was no end. There were only the next steps, the next lives to save, and the next challenges to face. The storm was harsh, the mountains were dangerous, and hell itself seemed to stretch endlessly before him. But he would walk into it, unflinching, until every soul in need was safe. The town of Frost Creek was quiet that morning, the streets empty except for the occasional figure, checking on their homes or breaking through the snow. The storm had eased, leaving behind a pristine white blanket that shimmered in the early light. But the town's people knew better. The blizzard had been merciless, leaving traces of its fury everywhere. Homes were damaged, animals were lost, and lives had been nearly claimed by the mountains. Yet there was hope now, a fragile, precious hope carried in the stories of survival and the courage of one man. Jake rode slowly through the outskirts, his horse plodding steadily through the snow. The town had celebrated the return of the miners the night before, and yet he had not stayed for the applause. He had checked on them, ensured they were safe, fed and warm, and then quietly moved on. This was not a journey for recognition. It was a mission of necessity, a calling that went beyond personal glory. He was a man who had suffered great loss and carried scars of the past, yet he had found purpose in the present. As he entered the town square, he noticed the faces of the townspeople peeking out from windows and doorways. They stared with awe, gratitude, and a mixture of disbelief. Stories of his bravery had spread quickly overnight. Some called him a hero, others whispered about the broken cowboy who had walked into hell itself and returned unscathed. Jake did not respond. He did not need their words. Their relief, their safety was enough. The sheriff approached him, a broad smile breaking through the usual tension in his face. "Jake," he said, his voice full of admiration, "you've done what no man would dare. You've brought them back. You've saved lives we thought were lost forever." Jake nodded quietly. "I did what had to be done," he said simply. "They needed help. I went. That's all." The miners, now safe and recovering in the town's inn, came forward one by one to express their gratitude. They spoke of the terror they had faced in the mountains, the near-certain death, and how Jake's presence had given them courage when all hope was gone. "We wouldn't be here without you," one whispered, his voice shaking with emotion. "You saved our lives." Jake offered them a small nod, his expression calm. He didn't speak of the past, of the loss that had shaped him, or of the fear he had faced in the blizzard. That was his burden, and he carried it alone. What mattered now was that these men, these families, were alive. And that was enough to drive him forward. As the morning light grew stronger, the town slowly came alive. Neighbors helped clear snow from roofs and paths. Children played carefully in the white drifts, and families reunited with loved ones who had been trapped or lost during the storm. The air was filled with relief, laughter, and quiet gratitude. Yet amidst all this joy, Jake remained a solitary figure on the edge of the town. His mission had been accomplished, and he knew it was time to move on. There were still dangers, still challenges, still lives in need of courage and guidance. Before leaving, he walked among the people who had survived, checking on the youngest, the oldest, and the weakest. He offered words of encouragement, small gestures of care, and reminders to stay cautious. Even now he could see the threat of the mountains in every frozen path, the danger in every unstable snowdrift. He had faced it once, and he knew it could return at any moment. As he prepared to leave Frost Creek, the townspeople gathered in the square. Children ran to him, clutching their small hands and wide-eyed with admiration. Adults bowed their heads, whispered prayers, and offered simple gifts of thanks. Yet Jake accepted none of it. He had not come for praise, nor for reward. His satisfaction came from the knowledge that the lives he saved could continue, that families would reunite, and that hope had been restored. A young boy, no older than 10, ran forward with a small bundle of wood and handed it to Jake. "For your fire," he said shyly. Jake took it with a small smile, nodding. The gesture, innocent and pure, reminded him why he did what he did. Courage, he realized, was not about recognition or glory. It was about the simple acts that made life possible for others. As he mounted his horse, he glanced back at the town one last time. Smoke rose from chimneys, people moved about their daily tasks, and life continued, fragile but enduring. The blizzard had tested them, had brought fear and desperation, but it had not broken them. They had survived, and in that survival they had witnessed courage. Jake guided his horse toward the edge of the mountains, where the paths grew treacherous and the snow lay deep and unyielding. The wind still howled, carrying with it a reminder that danger was never far. He rode with steady purpose, his mind alert, his eyes scanning the horizon for any signs of trouble. He had faced the blizzard, saved lives, and returned. Yet he knew his journey was far from over. The mountains were vast, the storms unpredictable, and the world full of people who might need someone brave enough to walk into hell to save them. As he disappeared into the snowy distance, the townspeople watched in silence. The broken cowboy had become a legend, not through words or boast, but through action. His courage had left a mark on Frost Creek that would be remembered for generations. Parents would tell their children of the man who had walked through the storm, who had faced the mountains and returned, who had saved lives when all hope seemed lost. For Jake, there was no celebration, no fanfare, and no rest. He was a man of action, driven not by recognition but by purpose. He carried the weight of his past, the loss that had shaped him, and the courage that had grown from it. Each step forward into the snow, each decision in the face of danger, was guided by a quiet strength that few could understand. He did not need applause. He needed only to continue, to do what was right, and to face whatever challenges awaited him in the frozen wilderness. The mountains stretched endlessly ahead, their peaks hidden in mist and snow. Jake knew that more storms would come, that more people might be trapped or in danger. And he would be there, walking into hell if necessary, facing the blizzard with determination and courage. He was not a hero in the way the townspeople would call him. He was a man who had learned to turn his pain into purpose, who had discovered that even the broken could rise to do extraordinary things. As the sun rose higher, reflecting off the snow, Jake's figure became smaller in the distance, blending with the white of the mountains. But his presence lingered in the hearts of Frost Creek's people. They would remember the bravery, the selflessness, and the quiet strength of the cowboy who had risked everything to save them. Even as he disappeared from view, the town knew one thing: courage could come from the most unexpected places. Hope could arrive on the back of a lone horseman, walking steadily into the fury of nature itself. And sometimes, it was the broken who became the strongest, the ones who carried scars not as weaknesses, but as reminders of what they had endured and what they could accomplish. The day continued, the town slowly returning to life, yet the story of Jake, the broken cowboy who walked into hell and returned with the lives of the trapped, would be told over and over. Around fires in the warmth of homes and on snowy streets, children would ask their parents about him, and parents would smile and say, "He was a man of courage, a man who showed us that even in the darkest times there is hope." And somewhere, far beyond the town, Jake rode on. Alone, determined, and unbroken in spirit. He had faced the blizzard, saved lives, and proved that even the most broken among us could rise to greatness. His journey was not finished, for the world was full of challenges, storms, and people in need. And as long as he drew breath, he would face them all, one step at a time, one life at a time, until every soul in need was safe. The mountains stood silent and eternal, their icy peaks gleaming under the sun. The storm had passed, but its lessons remained. Courage, determination, and selflessness had triumphed, and the memory of one broken cowboy, who dared to walk into hell to save others, would live forever in the hearts of those he touched.